that I left you yesterday with a cliffhanger. Anyway, a question the Gemara says was talking about doing measuring on Yontiv, measuring out flour and so on, and spoke about that a nachto, a cook, which is what it meant in that context, can measure out the spices in order to not ruin the dish. And I asked you what would be about a normal person. Well, the actual halacha is that even your normal balabas or balabuster can, if you're cooking on Yontiv, can actually measure out the spices, the ingredients, a teaspoon of this, a half a teaspoon of that. You're allowed to because of the concern, because that's like a normal type of measuring that takes place in the kitchen and is necessary in order to make sure that the dish comes out properly. The only thing that the poskim say is if you normally don't measure it out, if you normally just do a dash or like a pinch of salt, obviously don't do the measuring on Yontiv. But that's an interesting and important thing to know when you are cooking on Yontiv, that you actually can use your measuring spoon.
So that's personal. Okay. That's person specific. Some people may be more
Exactly. Okay, so now we begin. So that sort of was again with those things of all these issues related to cooking and to food preparation, which obviously is the dominant theme here. We now move to the next parak, which talks about which the opening discussion emphasizes again these issues of uvda dechol, but maybe also related issues of tircha. Let's take a look. And this is a little bit before you actually get to the kitchen itself. Hamevi kada yayin mimakom lamakom. So at the bottom of Chav Terem Bet. Hamevi kada yayin mimakom lamakom. If you bring jugs of wine from one place to another place, you're bringing them from your storage shed or whatever to your house. Lo yavim bisalu bekupa. Don't bring them like in a big basket, have like 20 jugs of wine carrying it in a basket or in a box. Aval maybe hu aktefo olefanav, but bring it on your shoulder or holding it in front of you, but don't schlep a huge amount all at the same time. Now, v'chein, I'll read this and then I'll step back and explain it. V'chein hamolichas hateven, or if you're bringing straw to your animals, lo yafshil et hakupa lachorav, don't take this huge box of straw and sort of carry it on your back. Aval miviyahu biyado, but you bring it holding it in front of you in your hand. What? Well, I'll talk about that. Okay, and you can start initially to use a pile of straw that you hadn't yet broken into from beforehand, and the assumption here is that you're using it for firewood. But not with wood that is in the muktzah, which is you can consider it like a storage shed. Rashi says specifically it's the alleyway behind the house. Again, fascinating that they had it was actually a noun of a type of a place that things were stored and put away, which then becomes, of course, also the name of muktzah, something that's off limits. But it's the same idea. It's things that are stored away and put and set aside. So you cannot break into your storage shed of wood if you have not begun using your wood for firewood. But you can break into your haystack or straw, your pile of straw in order to start using that. So exactly what the difference is there is not clear. That seems to be more of a muktzah problem, not just because of the use of the word, but because of what's going on. We'll worry about that in a minute. But let's first talk about all right, we'll worry about that. Let's first talk about the first part of the Mishnah, which is this idea of this shlep. What exactly is the concern? So if you take a look at Rashi, Rashi says, 5 lines down in the Rashi's beginning in the parak, just the middle of the Rashi, Denira kemasa dechol aseit masaot. It looks like very weekday that you're carrying big burdens is the type of thing you do on a weekday. Rashi says, if you just bring a small amount, clearly why are you bringing a couple of bottles? You bring bottles because you need wine in your house because it's going to be for a Yontiv meal. You need some straw to feed your animals. But if you bring huge amounts, Rashi doesn't underscore the tircha element, but he says if you do bring huge amounts, it looks more like weekday activity. You're taking care of you're on the farm, so you bring a ton of straw, or you're selling wine, you're transporting wine, you're bringing a box full of wine. But if you do small amounts, you're obviously taking care of immediate needs, and it's not so much about the type of general sort of business and larger sort of weekday engagement that you do. So that's Rashi's concern of uvda dechol. Tosas raises a question, so it's not about tircha now per se. Tosas raises a question that he says by Shabbos, we taught a Mishnah that seems to give you maybe even more latitude. If you take a look at the Tosos, Hamevi Kadayayim, we'll just look at a line of this because it's very important in understanding some of these nuanced differences. He says, V'teimadam, we know b'Shabbos perk mafnin arba kuparohei. It says you can take out 4 to 5 boxes of straw, from the barn. So here, why does it say don't take out a box of straw, or it's lo yaviyim bekupa? So Tosa says, okay. I'm going to skip to the second yet, which is more interesting, and he says like this. 1 minute. It says V'yesh Lomar, 5 lines down at the end of the line. Did people see it? V'yesh Lomar? The Lamad Peirashti Nicha, the Hasamai b'Shabbos. When it's a Shabbos issue, and there's a question about moving some straw around, Lo Havei K'uvda D'Chol. There's not a concern of uvda d'chol when somebody sees you moving straw around on Shabbos or whatever, wine from place to place. Why not? She'ein metalta kimi zavis lezavis bosabayis. He says, where's most of your carrying going to go on Shabbos? Assuming you don't have an Erev around the whole city, right? Most of your carrying will go from one part of your house to another part of your house, or maybe within a courtyard. They would have an Erev in a courtyard, but you're not going to be transporting it large distances. So you're going to be some small degree of movement. So their concern isn't uvda d'chol. If somebody sees you, walking down the street with a big box of straw, who knows? You're going, you're involved in your business activities. But if you're just doing it within the courtyard or within your house, it doesn't look like uvda d'chol. So the only concern there, says Tosfos, so what's the concern by Shabbos? So there the Gemara would rather, by Shabbos, that you take a big quantity and do fewer trips. Right, this is always the question I have when I'm bringing groceries home from the supermarket. We have this one cart that we can take stuff up from, from the garage. Do you try to do it all and get it done in one trip, or do you do multiple trips? So the Tosa says by Shabbos, the Gemara says, better to make fewer trips and a bigger schlep, because it's not uvda d'chol. And fewer trips in the large sense means, less effort than one trip with more quantity. So the concern by Shabbos is more the tircha issue and not the uvda d'chol. We want to be mima'ik b'tircha. He says, aval hachamai b'yontav. It's not as much the concern of tircha. What more dominates is mishum de mechzik uvda v'chol, because you're actually can be schlepping it large distances and not just within the house. Okay, so it says that's why we'd rather. It says don't take a big basket. Take a small, but if I take a small amount, I'm going to have to make 10 trips. Fine. So you'll make 10 trips. It'll be more effort, but it won't look as much like weekday activities. So it says these are competing values, right? A large amount or small amounts, multiple trips. And he says by Shabbos, the bigger concern is the effort. And therefore, we do something that's going to minimize the effort. By Yontiv, not because Yontiv, there are fundamentally different concerns, but once we're allowing transporting on Yontiv, the reality of transporting these things is going to raise much higher uvda d'chol realities. And therefore, that's the prime thing we want to address. And we're going to insist that you do small amounts, even if it's going to demand for multiple trips.
Does that depend what I'm schlepping? In other words, straw people take from the marketplace. Let's say I'm going here from base Midrash and taking svarim.
Right? Maybe it could be. The cases here might be specific. It's a good question. You're absolutely right. All right, so let's take a look now at the Gemara. But that also was very helpful, not just distinguishing Shabbos and Yontif, but raising the types of concerns. A tircha concern, as opposed to an uvda d'chol, and the Mishnah clearly is addressing itself to uvda d'chol, and therefore speaking about small quantities at a time, even if it winds up meaning multiple trips. Okay, let's take a look. Tana, we Tana Beitzah. Mutter, if you cannot do it for whatever reason in a different way, like this is your only way of transporting it, you can't make multiple trips in small amounts or whatever, the only way it's a bulky thing and the only way you can do it is on your back, okay, you have no choice, you'll be allowed to do it. Iskin Rava b'Mechuzah, Rava established in Mechuzah, which was Rava's town, Dedaru b'Dochka, those that carry with literally it means with effort. Rashi says that normally it means that they carry a burden on their shoulders, and it's a big heavy burden.
Daru doesn't
So
mean live?
no, daru, no, it means to carry. The daru berigla. Now, literally that means carry on your leg. How are you supposed to carry something on your leg is not clear. So Rashi says it doesn't mean literally leg. It means a type of a shovel or a pitchfork that would be used to carry something. So it would be a shinoi. Now Rashi consistently says in these Gemaras that you have to do a shinoi so it doesn't look like weekday activity, but Rashi says you have to try to make it that the shinoi also lightens the burden. Of course, the irony is that if you had a way to do it with less effort, why weren't you doing it that way during the weekday? Maybe it's a little bit more like, requires a little more contortion, but it still is sort of less in terms of the weight or in terms of that. Tosfos says it doesn't matter if it lightens the burden or not. The idea, as we've seen by Tosfos, is not the effort, but is the uvda d'chol. So with shinoi, even if it doesn't lessen the burden, for Tosfos is fine. But Rashi says it has to also be, or ideally it has to lighten the burden, and certainly can't increase the burden. Okay, so Dadar Rigla, those that normally things are carried with Rigla, which again for Rashi means like a pitchfork, Ladaru Be'igra, carry it literally on the roof, which Rashi says here that means like on your shoulder. I mean on your let me just check Rashi. Be'igra by b'mot, like not on your shoulder with a single person, but have like a what do you call it? Yeah, exactly, right. Have some type of a beam or whatever, some type of a stick that you use with somebody's help, you carry it on your shoulder. Again, to me that looks much more uvda d'chol, carrying something around on a big stick, together with two people. The daru be'igra, and things that are normally carried that way, the daru be'akfa, you should carry it be'akfa, which Rashi says means, what does Rashi say means? Hold on, let me remind myself. Oh, somehow, I don't know again the exact translation of the word, but Rashi says it means carry on a stick in front of you, not on your shoulder. Okay, fine. Didar ba'akfan, things that are normally carried that way and don't have another way of being carried, and you have to make some type of a shinoi. Nifra sudra iluya. Okay, so here it's clearly that it is about, obviously, the visuals. It's just, covered up with a blanket or something, literally with like a scarf. So it should be obvious that obviously you're transporting something, but the more it's done in its sneest way and it's covered up, the less it looks like an ovda d'chol. V'im lo efshar shari, and if there's no option to do it in any way that is different, fine, you can do it in the normal way, as we said in the first line. The Amamai miyav shalashana's mutter, because we taught in the Beitzah, we opened this discussion with that if there's no way to do it in a different way, it's permissible. Okay, so thank you. So Amar Rav Chanan bar Rava Rav Ashi. Chanan bar Rava said to Rav Ashi, Amar Rabbanan, the rabbis have said, if you're able, to the degree you're able to change, we change. Okay, we ask for you to do it in a different way if it's feasible. Yom Tova on Yontiv. The Hahani Nashi, 1 minute. He says, I observed something that I'm not happy with, that looks like this problem of appearing of weekday activity, and people aren't bothering to do it in a different way. Because there are these women, the Kamalyan Chatzivayu Maya B'Yom Tova, they go and they fill their buckets with water on Yantiv. Rashi says it means from the well. I'm from the river. I don't know how he knew it's not the well, but okay. They go and fill their buckets of water on Yantiv. Lo Kamishanyan, and they don't do it in any different way. So you see them bringing the water back to town. Again, this was the time before, indoor plumbing, and it looks just the way they schlep water during the weekday. So, it has that same weekday feel to it. V'lo kamishanina, they don't do it in any different way. V'lo mini. And we don't say anything to them. And how do we sort of allow that to happen without comment? So Amalei, so he said back to him, Mishum de lo efshar, look, this is in the category of things that you cannot reasonably change. Why can't you reasonably change? Hey, what do you want them to do? Demali b'chatz v'rabba, those that normally fill the water use a big bucket to fill the water. So you would say, Demali b'chatz v'zuta, why not do smaller buckets? So it's very nice for you to suggest doing smaller buckets. Kamafish bihilucha. You're going to have to make multiple trips. Now, Tosfos just said that in the Mishnah, that's what happens. We ask the person to do a smaller amount, that we prefer multiple trips if it doesn't look as much of a weekday. But what Tosfos says, Tosfos is aware of that. So what he says is, yeah, but in the Mishnah, it's unusual to carry those amounts in small quantities. So that's why it doesn't look like uvda d'chol. As we're about to see, some people would schlep the water with big buckets. Some people would schlep up the water with small buckets. So whichever way you switch, it doesn't really look different. It might be different for you, but it doesn't look different than the weekday. And it doesn't accomplish anything. If anything, that small benefit that it's different for you comes at a cost. And therefore it's not really a feasible option. Yes.
Do you have anything to say about the tone of the language here? In other words, it sounds like eitzes.
Right.
It doesn't sound like it's like this is usher, but the diavad. It sounds like the whole language here. Like what's the?
Yeah, it's a good point, and I think that the whole issue of uvda d'chol, is in general is a hard area to paskin in when it comes to Shabbos and Yom Tov because it is so amorphous and so contextual, but besides shvut, it's amorphous and contextual, and it's not the type of quantitative, concrete parameters were usually given, which makes sense because it is about experientially, and it's really impossible and would be some ways counterproductive to try to think we could quantify them. And it's also difficult because on some degree, as you're seeing, it's like the biggest deal, not the biggest like a doraisa, but the biggest deal because it completely impacts the experiential aspect of does it feel like Shabbos and Yom Tov or does it not feel like Shabbos and Yom Tov. On the other hand, many uvda d'chol is rarely made like an isser d'Rabbanan. Like now, some of it we had before. Like some types of the things that we had before, the Gemara said the underlying concern was uvda d'chol, but it was formulated and articulated in a strict isser, you can't use the scale, you can't use the cane or whatever. I mean, these types of things was formulated as whatever those concerns led to promulgating a technical isur. Right here, right? It's here it does sound more like guidelines, and the very fact that we look at it contextually, if there's no other option, you can do it. Just look at the language of the Mishnah. Lo yivyein b'sala b'kupa. It doesn't say asr lahavi, it doesn't say it's forbidden, right? It talks about how you should go about it. So you make an excellent point, and I think that continues to play out. When sometimes people ask shilas about Shabbos or Yom Tov, and the biggest issue is uvda d'chol. So on the one hand, how do you assess it? And on the other hand, it's how do you impart to people that it's a real serious issue in terms of the texture of Shabbos? And at the other hand, it might not have this sort of formalized weight that other areas of halacha do. So you do make an excellent point. Let's just finish this, and then I'll get to the other question. So he says, if you can't go in what do you want him to do? Any change won't be a big difference because, as Tosu says, they do it that way. Other people do it that way anyway, and it comes at a cost. So so people that normally do it in small buckets, you want to say tamali b'chatz rabba, let them now do it in big buckets. But that also comes at a cost. It makes it heavier. So everything will come at some cost, and it's going to not really be much of a shinoi anyway. So you want to say, but look, we said before, if you can't carry it in a different way, cover it up with a scarf. So tchaskya b'nechemta, covered up with some type of a scarf. So zimnin denafil the asi lasuye. So I'm sorry, nechemta is Rashi says it's like a piece of wood. Excuse me. Hold on, let me just check Rashi. Kiso shel 8. I'm sorry. So cover it up with a wood cover, but sometimes it'll fall down and you'll carry it. Now, who really cares about carrying it? It's Yom Tov, so some take out that phrase. But what it means is because you don't want it to fall down, it'll lead to the next problem, to katre. So they're going to want to tie this wood cover to cover up their barrel, and that'll be the shinoi. Zimdim the mafsik. Sometimes the knot will break. The asi lemiktare, and then they'll come to knot it, and then you can't make a knot on Yom Tov. Of course, a minute ago it said knot it, but maybe it means you'll knot it from before Yom Tov, but then it'll break and you'll knot it again on Yom Tov. Or Rashi also indicates that maybe the first knot is more of a temporary knot, but then it keeps on falling off, and you'll make more of a permanent knot. So that won't be a solution because a cover will lead to you doing some other problem. Okay, so don't cover it with a wood plank. Tifra sudra uluya. How about put a scarf on top of it? Some type of a cloth cover. No. Zimni dimitatish b'maya. So the cloth will get wet with the water. Vasim they sleep, and you'll come to squeeze this out.
The water here? You don't want the water. Because you don't want the water.
Well, yeah, but you want it. You're trying to transport water. Hilkach lo efshar. Therefore, there's no feasible option. Now, Tosfos asked, why was it different before when we talked about transporting wine and we said cover it with a cloth? So Tosfos said, well, first of all, he says here you got a bucket with a big open, mouth. So obviously, if something is covering the top of it, it's going to get very wet. If you're a barrel of wine with a little opening at the top, we're not so much concerned about schita. The other difference gets to what Michael says, which is what's the prohibition of schita? And there are two prohibitions of schita. One is if you get something wet with water, then schita, you wring out clothes as part of the laundering process. The other is if it's absorbed, not water, but other liquids, then the only problem with schita is like squeezing out fruit. It's because you're trying to extract the what's contained because you want it. So the nafkamina is, what if the thing that you're extracting is going to waste? What if you squeeze out your shirt over dirt and it all goes to waste, or over on top of a floor? So if it's water that's absorbed, it's still a problem because you're laundering the shirt. But if it's something like wine that's absorbed or juice that's absorbed, so the whole problem is because you're trying to extract the liquid, and here the liquid's going to waste, it's not really a problem. Questions about lechatchila or whatever. Anyway, so it says that's another difference. If the cloth absorbed wine, then if the wine accidentally gets squeezed out, it's going to waste. It wouldn't be a problem. But if it absorbed water and that gets squeezed out, and even if it falls on the floor, you're still having a problem of laundering. So here there's a problem of schita. It's much more likely it'll get wet, and if you squeeze it out, it's much more likely that it will be a problem. So therefore the Gemara says there's no reasonable option, so we do it the normal way. Yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand this a little bit better. But we don't say, okay, well, let's say you usually do it, get your husband to do it or something like that, right?
Right.
So we don't have to go that.
Well, that's not really, that's like a very subjective shinoi for you. Here, the uvda d'chol has much more to do with the experiential reality it creates. It's sort of at the societal level. What does it look like? But not like a look like Maris Ayin. How does it make us? What does it do to the texture of Yontiv? And that has to do much more with how it's experienced by others, not just your subjective. When we talk about normal shinoi, we'll turn it on with your elbow or something. That's so that at your very personal malacha level, you're doing the act with a shinoi, which makes less of a transgression. Here, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the shinoi impacts the way in which this act is experienced and how it impacts the, like I said, like the texture of the day. So therefore, the subjective shinoi is less relevant.
And before the Gemara just basically moved it like one down. If you do it this way, do it that way. But you have to go 2 steps different. Like, usually do it this way, you can do it 2 ways differently.
No, I don't know. Again, it seems more like guidelines than any such thing. Moshe, you have a question? No? You have a question? No? Okay. Yeah.
This schita issue implies potentially a person could wash their face with a washcloth on Yontif and squeeze it out, the water goes away.
Yeah. You don't get it sopping wet. I mean, that's the real issue. Okay, so now the Gemara continues. Okay, so where are we? Hilkach lo after. Amalei Rabbi bar Rav Chanin labai. So Rabbi bar Rav Chanin said to Abaye, it's not. Now, since we said we don't sort of say anything to these women, it's going to lead to, again, here's a male rabbi saying things about saying or not saying things to women, but well, it's okay. We'll start talking about men too in a minute. But again, if Rivka were here, wonder what she would say about all of this. So anyway, but now we turn to a broader discussion around those issues, which actually is a very important discussion. It relates to many other things, as we'll see in a minute. So Amalei Rabbi bar Rav Chanin labai. Rabbi bar Rav Chanin said to Abai, it's not, we're talking the Mishnah. Actually, this is a Mishnah we're going to see in about a week. Less. You don't sort of clap, and Misapkin, Rashi says, is not clapping 2 hands, but clapping like on the thigh, and you don't dance, and you don't do these things on Yontif. Now, what's the reason not? So the Gemara says the reason is because you might come to, fix a vest, like a musical instrument. You'll pick up a musical instrument, you'll come to fix it, and that's the problem, makes it a gzeira. It's actually worth noting that in its original locus in the Tosefta, where this, or not locus, but in the parallel source in the Tosefta, where this comes from, it sounds like what we're talking about is not like dancing like you do on like, let's sing a nice nigun and dance. It sounds like what you're doing is you're out in the field and you're clapping and you're jumping up and down. Why would you be doing that out in the field? Well, no, to scare away the birds. This is in a Tosefta which discusses uvda d'chol. It says al yaseh kiderech shu oseh b'chol. It's really directly about Avdil Kol because it's sort of like activities that are done to attend to your field and to attend to those types of, business or income-related concerns. Interestingly, that's not how the Bavli interprets it. The Bavli interprets it as this concern that you'll make musical instruments. Anyway, whatever the concern is, people went then and violated it. So it says, but now we see that people actually go ahead and do this. They do the clapping or the dancing or whatever they're doing. And how come we let them do it and we don't comment on it? Right? Why don't we say anything? Why do we tolerate it? So Amrullah, so you see the parallel to the case of the drawing of the water, but now it's about men doing activities. And either way, the question is, well, where are the rabbis? We have a responsibility. We should be saying something. So Amrullah, he said back to him, according to your reasoning, Had Amar Rava, or this question exactly it was, but anyway, Had Amar, is it Rabba or Rava? Person should not sit by the mouth of the l'chayayim, the post, by the opening of a mabui. Maybe an object will roll around and you'll come to carry it. What does that mean? It means, if you remember back to our Eruvin days, right? You had these courtyards, right, which had all these houses opened up, and there were walls around it, and you would do like a lechi or a korah, etc., to allow you to carry. And then you had multiple courtyards opening up into a mabui, right, which is like a alley, okay, and also was surrounded by these walls. And if you have a l'chayayim, if you have a lechi, I should say, if you have a post or a korah or a beam, then you're allowed to carry in the courtyard. Okay, now, what purpose does the lechi serve? It means here you are, and you're playing ball in the courtyard, or you have an object, and you want to, and maybe the ball rolls away, and you're going to go after it. But to go after it, you're going to pass the lechi, and you're going to see that lechi, or you'll see that korah, and that'll remind you you're about to cross a threshold, and it'll remind you don't step out and carry something out or carry something back in. So one of the purposes it serves is exactly to demarcate and tell you you're about to cross a threshold. Well, if you're sitting right over here, right? And your back is to the lechi, and you're sitting right there, and you're holding something, even if technically you're like in the courtyard and holding it, what's going to happen? The thing will roll out, and you'll go after it, and you're not going to see the heker, because you're sitting right at the line, and it's to your back. And therefore, we say, don't sit by the lechi. Okay, let's read that again. Don't sit by the mouth of the courtyard, right by the lechi. Maybe an object will roll away, and you'll come to carry it. The ha-hani nashi, but again, how about these women? To shaklin chatzuvayu, they take their buckets. The ozin v'yatin apuma de mavoa, and they sit with their buckets by the mouth of the mabui. Again, this will be your Shabbos concern because it's about carrying. We don't say anything to them. Now again, this is only concern where might it lead. It's not, but it still is violating Rava's rule. So how do we? And if we're concerned that might lead to carrying, how is it we don't say anything about it? So how is it that we tolerate these various types of activities? Ella, so he said, I'll tell you what the answer is. So Abayi said, how do we not say anything? So Rav Chanan says, there's other things that happen we don't say anything about. So what's the explanation? How do we tolerate it? Ella, Hanachlem li Yisrael, leave the Jewish people alone. Mutav shu shogig and value mizidin, better they should transgress unintentionally than transgress willingly, which means, the same way, as the Gemara says some other place, the same way it's a mitzvah to say something that'll be heard, it's a mitzvah not to say something that won't be heard. Okay, so if saying something means that it'll be productive. If in the end what it will lead to is that it'll be that people will ignore you and it'll be flouted more openly, then besides at the personal level, let's say, it turns them from a shogeg into a mazid. But what it also does is it leads even to a more undermining of rabbinic authority, right? So you have to know to pick your battles, and if this is going to lead to people disregarding it and dismissing it, it's not going to be helpful to try to make a point about it. So sometimes it's better to tolerate certain things, okay? And even at their level, but they're sinning, but they would be sinning anyway otherwise, and this way at least they're doing it unintentionally. If that's how we assess the situation, obviously you have to assess, will my saying something do good or not do any good in this situation. And now the Gemara continues, so the same way that's true about the case of Rava and the post, it's also true about this dancing and clapping and so on. Now, what's the limit to this issue? How often do you always tolerate all situations? So the Gemara first suggests maybe this is only sometimes do we not say anything. That's by rabbinic violations. It should be mentioned that both of the violations we mentioned before were in themselves, the way the Bavli understands it, a concern lest it lead to a more serious violation, lest you fix a musical instrument, lest you come to carry. In itself, right? So not only is it rabbinic, but it's even like a rabbinic safeguard. So maybe there we're willing to keep our keep quiet. But for a biblical violation, maybe, says the Gemara initially, we wouldn't be quiet. We would have to say something. Okay? Now, why would you say something if it's not going to do any good? So the simple explanation, I'll say something else in a minute, but the simple explanation is, look, you never know if it's going to do any good, and maybe it won't do any good today, but, maybe if you keep on working at it, eventually you'll get through to people. So, nobody is a prophet, so maybe if it's a much more weighty violation, you have more of a responsibility to keep on trying, and even if you think that it's not going to do any good. So let's assume that's the issue, okay? But so we think that by Doraisas you have to say something. So the Gemara says, below. But you know what? That distinction is not true. Lo shna b'doraisa, lo shna b'dorabanan. And it doesn't matter, says the conclusion of the Gemara, whether it's biblical or rabbinic. Lo aminu lo midi. We keep our quiet. We don't say things to people that are violating in a case where we assume they won't listen to us. How do I know that? The hatoseves Yom Kippurim doraisahu. Adding to Yom Kippur is a biblical idea, like not just to start when it's sunset, but to add some minutes to it, right? Erev at Erev, the Gemara learns, is an idea to add minutes to Yom Kippur, to stop eating from even before sunset. The achlu v'shasu, and people eat and drink right up to sunset. Well, and we keep our quiet. So based on what we're doing, not just what they're doing, but the reality that we're not saying anything proves, says the Gemara, that sometimes even by Doraisas, it's best not to say anything. Now, a couple of points to make about this. First of all, Tosfos says, look, it can't literally mean they eat up to the very last second, because then obviously nobody can time it that well, and obviously then people would come to be eating on Yom Kippur. So they must stop like a minute before. So Tosfos says, so why isn't that minute Tosefes Yom Kippur? So Tosfos says, well, no, obviously it means Tosefes Yom Kippur has to be something a little bit more substantial than just a minute, but he doesn't exactly know how much it is, and that leads to an interesting discussion in the Rishonim. What is the minimum amount that would qualify as Tosefes Yom Kippurim? Some say a half hour, some say a lot less. But anyway, that's one point. But anyway, the other issue is about this issue about basically this is an issue of like tochacha, saying something. Is that really true that even by a biblical violation, even when it gets to the example of the biblical violation, notice it picks one that is sort of very much at the periphery, right? It's not like an explicit verse. It's not a negative prohibition. It's a mitzvah to add a few minutes to Yom Kippur, right?
It's also not clearly marketed. It's not like lighting a fire.
Exactly. You mean how much do you add, right? Which is also part of the question, right? So basically what develops the halacha is that the following case is the one that you do have to say something even if you think it won't do any good, which is A, it's biblical, and B, it's mefurish b'kra. It's like explicit. Like the Torah there says, don't do malacha on Shabbos. Now, it's not exactly explicit what counts as malacha. But it doesn't have to be that explicit. Okay, but the prohibition is explicit. In that case, you have to say something, even if you don't think it'll do any good. Now, why? Again, let's ask, why is that different? If it's not going to do any good, why is that different? So one answer could just be, like I said, because you never know. You're not a prophet, and maybe it will do some good. How about the answer of mutav yu shogegim? So, and why does it matter if it's explicit or not? So this might be the point. It's that the ability to say that somebody is a shogeg, if the prohibition is explicit, it's like a less of a legitimate claim, I didn't know. It's like black and white, so even if it's technically true you didn't know, it doesn't so much exonerate you. So anyway, since it's pretty explicit, the fact that you could better shogeg than mazy, you're not such a big shogeg to begin with. Okay, that sounds like the reason why, that if it's explicit and it's biblical, we got to try and do something, because anyway, A, it might do some good, you never know, and B, you're not such a shogeg to begin with. But another possible explanation about this is not just that maybe it'll do some good. It raises an interesting question by Tochacha. Exactly. correctly, which is sometimes, even if it's not going to do any good, if nobody says anything, then that means, and that basically, who is standing up for the Torah? Who's defending the Torah's honor? Who's saying there's a problem here? It doesn't matter if this guy's going to listen to you, but we were talking before about uvda d'chol. What reality do you create for everybody else? That, violations occur and nobody says anything. It means it's okay. It means it's tolerated. Sometimes the rabbi has to get up and say that this is wrong, even if the people who are violating aren't going to listen to him. At least everybody is hearing that that there's a problem here. So that's an important aspect of the tochacha as well. Especially like in the I don't know. This is like lahav deal, obviously, but just in the after. Yesterday was Yom HaShoah, and the point about what does it mean to be a silent bystander. The only thing that evil needs to succeed is for who's the one who said that good men to stand by and say nothing. Somebody's got to get up and say that this is wrong, even if the violators aren't listening. Hopefully, somebody will listen. Yes.
But could you just, if you don't mind, just then I'm going to get into slightly murky waters, but we can't clap. So a lot of people clap the bima.
We'll worry about that in a week from now when we get to that Mishnah. Okay. Now, yes.
Rashi's in the top king answers that.
Yeah, Tosa says, "What are you talking about, Ava? You're not allowed to do that on Yom Tov from Chol Moed." Yeah, I don't know. So anyway, yeah.
I think maybe the whole thing is really experiential. As you mentioned before, really showgazing in the sense that no one would intentionally violate Yom Kippur. What you have to point out to them is that you have to be Mosif. In other words, he himself is trying to eat up until the last minute, which means he's not being Mosif.
Right.
So you have to teach him that he needs to be Mosif. Because
right.
No one's going to eat intentionally violate.
Right.
It's just like the whole thing.
Right.
I think it was the Potter Stewart in you.
Right.
I mean, it is. It's just a question. I can't define it, but I'll recognize it when I see it.
Right. But by the way, the case about the teaching to be Mosif is correct. When the Gemara says it's still rice, that doesn't mean not eating on Yom Kippur is rice. It means the idea of adding to Yom Kippur is rice, and that's the thing that you have. Right. Exactly.
Because you haven't explained
exactly.
This is a real obligation.
Exactly. And that's, I think, a good point as well, which I was thinking to say that maybe also the difference of Mefurish B'Kra is that there's a well, no, actually it works the opposite, because according to that, meaning maybe somebody just needs to be educated, that would create a greater reason to be saying something in the things that are less explicit. Maybe they just need to be informed, right? So, but it works out the opposite, because when it's less explicit, you have less, you're more pulled back. Okay, very important Gemara is about tochacha and about, when do we say things and not say things. Let's get back now to this issue about schlepping or whatever, uvdu d'chol an yantev. You can start by, you can break into the pile of straw, but not into the wood shed. So says the Gemara, Amar Rav Kahana, says Rav Kahana, Zosomeres matchilin ba'utzar tchila. You're allowed to break into your storage shed for, and if you're storing apples or wheat or whatever you're storing, you're allowed to break into it and start using it on Yantiv, and it's not a muktzah problem. Money, who's this going like? Reb Shimon, the Leisley muktzah. Again, notice the use of the word muktzah in different ways. It's Reb Shimon who generally isn't concerned with muktzah. Doesn't mean he doesn't know the muktzah at all, but he has a much, much lower threshold. And therefore, just the fact that you're storing, your apples in your shed doesn't mean they're off limits. Even if in your mind you were closing them up, but it's something that always in theory you could use. And that's who it's going like. Ema Seifa, let's look at the end of the Mishnah. Avalo be'etzim sheba muktzah, but you can't use the wood in the storage shed. Also, the Rebbe Yehuda, he's like muktzah. That's Rebbe Yehuda holds of muktzah. Meaning, it's a funny way of asking, but it basically says, what is the difference between the straw and the wood? Okay, right. But it says it to tell you this idea that you're keeping stuff in a shed, stuff that's totally usable, but you in your mind have put it aside and kept it in the shed. Is that enough to make it muktzah? And that would be a debate of Rebbe Yehuda and Rebbe Shimon. So, how do we understand the difference between the straw and the wood? So the Gemara says like this. And here we're dealing with like different types of cedar wood. When we say don't use the wood in the shed, we're not talking about twigs, we're not talking about logs, we're talking about nice, good cedar beams. And now on Yom Tov, all of a sudden you decided, I have nothing else to use, I might as well use them for my fire. No, that's not just because in your mind you're planning not, you hadn't thought about starting to use it. That's something that's muktzah machmas chisar and kiss. Because of its value, it's totally off limits, and even Rabbi Shimon would agree that is muktzah. And that's the special case of the wood. Okay, some say the question was asked starting by the end and working backwards. You can't use the wood in the storage shed if this is the first that you're breaking into it, right? Again, the point is it's the first you're breaking into it. That says that you cannot initially break into stuff that you have been storing away because it's muktzah in your mind. You're not ready to use it yet. Money, who's this going like? Rebbe Yehuda, these muktzah, it's Rebbe Yehuda. But how about the first statement? You can break into the pile of straw. So, which is, you can break into stuff you've put aside. That's like Rebbe Shimon, who's not bothered by that. So, again, what's the difference between the straw and the twig? So, the Gemara says, no. Hasam b'tav nasarya. So there, it is like Rebbe Yehuda, that normally stuff that you have set aside and put in storage that you haven't broken into yet, you haven't started using yet, is considered muktzah, is considered off limits. So what's the story then with the straw? He says, well, the straw is a little bit spoiled, and therefore it's a little like a moldy, and therefore it's still usable for firewood, but it's not usable. Why do you normally store straw? For animals, but it's at a stage where it's no longer usable for animals. So once that's true, then you obviously would want to start using it for firewood. It's not so much anymore like it's in storage and put away in something you're not ready to start using it for. So the Gemara says, 1 minute, hachazi latina. If it's starting to spoil, you can still use it for making a plaster, and therefore maybe it is still something that you're going to want to keep in storage till you're ready to use it for that. No, the East coats him. It's got thorns and thistles, and therefore it's not even usable for plaster. So basically, it's Rebbe Yehuda that if stuff is in storage, it's considered to be, even if it's usable, the fact that you've kept it in storage and you haven't started using it makes it muktzah, except that now we're saying it's the special case of straw, which is something that would be on your mind to use when it's starting to get moldy and would be something that you would no longer feel as like put away and in storage. Okay, but anyway, that's the important debate of Rebbe Yehuda and Rebbe Shimon about what is your threshold for muktzah. And again, there it's applied to an issue where something which is fundamentally usable, you just have set it aside and haven't, and in your mind are not yet ready to use it. Let's take a look now at the next, Amud Bet, at the next Mishnah. Yes.
Quick question. There seems to be an obvious distinction that Gemara is not bringing up, which is that these are both, this stam, firewood, and straw are both things that normally we use on Yom Tov.
Right.
In this particular case, you put them away.
Right.
So since you put them away before Yom Tov, they're not designated for use on Yom Tov.
Right.
So the argument is it's designated for not use on Yom Tov.
Right.
But what about using it for not its own use? Taking the straw to start a fire,
right?
So you're not using it for the use for which you set it aside.
Right. So that's a good question. Actually, the assumption here is, I didn't get into that, but the Tosfos raises that issue. Like, if you have wood set aside for firewood, then to use it for firewood is less of like a muktzah issue. I don't know if you were thinking the opposite, but anyway, this is what Rosa says. Right, for animals, well, for firewood is a bigger problem. You think it's better? Anyway, Tosfos right. For the reason it was set aside, but on the other hand, it's more out of your head that as long as you set it aside for animals, to use it for animals was at least somewhere there in your head. Anyway, Tosfos raises that issue that it is funny that one of them seems to be using for what you were anyway going to use it for, and you just haven't started using, and the other not for that. So Tosfos does raise that problem. Let's take a look now at the next Mishnah. You cannot take sticks away from the sukkah. Presumably, this is understood to be that you have, again, not necessarily, this is a hot, not necessarily sukkah on Sukkot, although it's one out of the 3 chagim here. But anyway, but this is presumably, again, like a muktzah issue, because again, we were talking about taking sticks from the storage shed, so you're taking sticks from the sukkah, but you can take it from something that's near the sukkah. Now, what does that mean? So the Gemara assumes what it means is that sukkah means here is the actual thatched roof. So here's your sukkah with your thatched roof. So don't take it from the schach, okay, but if you've got some sticks that are, or let's do it on top, if you've got stuff that's not the schach itself, but there's some sticks that are lying on top of the schach, it's near the schach, so it reads sukkah as schach, then you can take those sticks off of the schach. Those aren't muktzah, but the sticks that are part of the schach itself is muktzah. So the Gemara says, I don't get the difference. You can't take it out of the schach because even for getting muktzah, you're destroying an oel. You're not allowed to build or to deconstruct on yontif. So taking stira, so taking it out of the roof, something that's part of out of a building, like taking a brick out of a building, although you haven't demolished the whole building, that's soter. So so even if you have sticks the way Rashi, they're just lying on top of the schach, but sticks lying on top of the schach become incorporated into the schach. What is schach? Except it's like various sticks and stuff on top of the roof, so they become part of the schach. So taking them away is also destroying the structure. So the Gemara says, my samach, what does it mean, the sticks that are nearby? Samach ledefanos. It does not mean on top of the schach. It means if you have some sticks lying against the wall. Sticks lying on the schach become incorporated into the schach, and they're seen as part of the roof. So to take them away is destroying the roof. Sticks lying against a wall, just physically, the way they're set up, right? This is like a very solid, like a well-defined structure. These are obviously external to it, and therefore they're not part of the wall, and therefore it is not a problem. They're not looked at, it's not destroyed.
Whereas here, should have said, minadofin.
Okay. No, you can't take it out of a stick of the wall because that's destroying a structure. Okay. So it's near the sukkah, okay? Not something that's on the sukkah. On the sukkah means anything on the roof is part of the sukkah. The walls are part of the sukkah. You can't remove any part of that that's destroying the structure. But something that's near the sukkah, not the schach, leaning against a wall, that's okay.
So it's the word la I don't like.
Yeah, okay. Fine. The sukkah is the whole structure. Okay. So the Gemara says like this, Rav Menashe Amar, afilu tema b'she'ein samach ledefanos, even if it's not against the wall, even if it's on the schach, ki tanya hi ba'asuraisa. When we're talking about taking sticks off of the near it, which near it can mean near the schach, not just near the wall, we're talking that you've got a bundle of sticks on top of your schach, and it's clearly distinct from the schach. Okay, if you have a few types of branches, well, that's what schach is. But if you've got your stick bundle, your firewood bundle on top of it, clearly it remains distinct, and therefore it's not a problem of destroying a structure. It never becomes incorporated into the structure. Okay.
So in the last
Yes.
mention that would have to be bundles of wood that you would mentally designated for use on that.
Well, no, you don't. Whether you don't necessarily have to add. No. It's only b'otsar, stuff that's stored away. You don't have to actively designate normal types of things.
Not a full storage.
No. Stored away means it's like I've got a whole storage shed, and I'm like, I'm not starting that until I'm ready. Like the example I gave before is like, I buy these shirts and I keep them in my package, and I don't want to take them out until I'm ready to take them out because, anyway. So that's very different than the types of stuff that's there to be used as you need it. Okay, so now the Gemara continues. Tanya with Beitzah, Rabbi Bar Yosef coming to Rabbi Yochanan, ein notlim eitzim min hasukkah eli min hasamuchla, what we said. Rabbi Shimon matir, Rabbi Shimon allows. Now the Gemara is going to say, 1 minute, if we said don't take means stuff that's incorporated into the structure, how would Rabbi Shimon allow you? Isn't that the problem of destroying a structure? So we'll have to figure that out. It's not just a muktzah issue, or if we're saying that it's stuff that's really part of the structure of the sukkah. So that's one issue is Rabbi Shimon. V'shavim b'sukkah zachag b'chag, but they agree when talking about a sukkah of sukkahs on sukkahs. So we're also talking about the mitzvah, the mitzvah object of a sukkah, she'asura, that is forbidden. Even Rabbi Shimon would agree that's forbidden to take a piece away from it, because that's not just a muktzah or destroying a tent issue. That's also an idea of designated for the mitzvah, which is a separate category. And if you stipulate, then your stipulation works that allows you to take stuff away from the sukkah, even on Sukkot. We'll see what that means. So now let's unpack this. So the Gemara says like this, Rabbi Shimon matir. So let's go to the first line that Rabbi Shimon, forget sukkahs for now, lets you take something out of the sukkah, from the wall or the roof. How could that be? You're destroying a structure, a tent. So Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, hacha b'sukkah nofalas askinan. We're talking about nofelet. A sukkah, it's funny, it uses the present tense verb, but it's a sukkah that has fallen down. Okay, and therefore there's not a problem of destroying a structure. Yontif began, it's Pesach. Yontif began, and your hut was standing. So everything was off limits because you can't take something away because it's be destroying the thing. So that means now it fell down over Pesach, or on the first day of Pesach. Can I now use the firewood? Well, now you don't have a problem of destroying a tent, but you do have a problem of muktzah, because it was off limits when Yontif began. But Rabbi Shimon would say, now that the sukkah is down, I don't hold of those types of things being muktzah. They're fundamentally usable, and therefore you can use it. Okay, so that's the issue. Now it has become a muktzah issue. For Reb Shimon l'taimei delays muktzah, and Reb Shimon is reasoning that doesn't hold of muktzah, even though when Yontif began, it was off limits, because at that time it would be an isser to remove it. And here's a parallel case of something that was usser to use when Yontif began, but when it becomes accessible, according to Reb Shimon, it's okay. Tanya, we turn to Beitzah, Mosar, not mutter, Mosar Hashem and Shebener. If you have leftover oil from your lamp, and now the fire has gone out, and can you use the it was burning when Shabbos began. Can you use the leftover oil, b'shebekara, or in the plate? Also, you can't use it. It's muktzah because it was off limits when Shabbos began. When Shabbos began, you couldn't take the oil because it would be like kiboy. It would be leading to a diminution of the flame. Rabbi Shimon Matir, Rabbi Shimon allows it, even though it was off limits when Shabbos began. Now it's accessible. Now it's okay. The same true with a sukkah that fell down, and that's what it's about. So the Gemara says, 1 minute. Me dummy. How can you compare those cases? Hasam Adam Yoshev Umitzapa Emisai Techaben Nero. In the first case, a person is waiting for the candle to go out. Now, it doesn't literally mean that, because if you were waiting for the candle to go out, why'd you light it in the first place? But it means that you are anticipating. The natural course of events will be that the candle will burn out, and there will be leftover oil, and you're expecting there to be leftover oil. So that Rabbi Shimon should allow you to use the oil that was expected to happen anyway. So we could say it was somewhere in your mind. But in this case, Adam Yoshev Umitzape Emasai Tipo Sukaso? Do you think a person is waiting, expects the sukkah to fall down? So even Rabbi Shimon shouldn't say it's allowed, because it's nothing that you would have expected and was off limits when Shabbos began or Yontif began. Fine. So it was a shaky sukkah. If you want to say that Reb Shimon would demand that it be in your mind, we could be talking about a sukkah that's very fragile, that, you were expecting it to some degree to fall down, and that's why Rabbi Shimon says when it falls down, it's not a muktzah issue. Okay, now we get to the second part. So that had to do with the muktzah problem. Now we get to the issue about the sukkah on sukkahs. That's off limits according to everybody. That's a principle of huktzah mitzvah. So we'll see in a minute another principle of things designated for a mitzvah. But a t'nai will work. If you stipulate you want to be able to use it, that'll work. So let's take a look at the Gemara. So the Gemara starts with the t'nai issue. Does a stipulation work? Now we're going to see why the sukkah is off limits on Sukkot. For another reason. How do you know the wood of a sukkah, presumably of the schach, some say even of the walls, is off limits the whole week, right? There's not a normal idea of muktzah on Chol HaMoed, so this is not the normal muktzah. This is a separate idea that something designated for the mitzvah, maybe particularly a sukkah, because we're going to have a pasuk, is off limits for all of Sukkot. Okay, how do you know that? Shenemar Chag HaSukkos Shivas Yamim LaHashem. A celebration of Sukkot 7 days to God. V'tayim v'tan b'retz. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Omer. Minayin shekashem shechal shem hashamayim al hachagiga. Assuming God's name takes place, descends on the korban chagiga, which is what chag means. The bringing of a korban chagiga. So it really is sanctified. So the sukkah becomes sanctified. So here's this idea that, and something that this is a real dioraisa, this idea that there's this concept of sanctity to the sukkah. So Talmud Lomar, so how do you know that it's true? Chag HaSukkos Shivas Yamim LaHashem. So 7 days to God. Machag LaHashem, the same way the chagigas to God. Av Sukkah LaHashem. And the Gemara understands if it is real sense of this idea of being sanctified, again, it doesn't mean you can't get benefit from it, because else how could you sit in the sukkah on sukkahs? But sanctify in the sense that it can't be used for anything else. So what good does a t'nai make? This should be an absolute thing. It's not just a question of your das and being muktzah or not being muktzah. It's fundamentally about its status. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Menashe, says Rav Menashe, fine. Grade Rava, Seifa Aslan L'Sukkah D'Alma. No, the end where it says you can make a stipulation, we're not talking about sukkah on sukkahs anymore. We're going back to your hot on Pesach. And there we're saying that even though Rabbi Yehuda says it falls down, it's muktzah if you explicitly say before Yontif, if this sukkah falls down, I want to use it for firewood, then even Rabbi Yehuda would say it's not muktzah. But we're not talking about sukkahs. Sukkahs, you're right, the sukkah remains off limits, no stipulation can help. Avol sukkah de mitzvah lo mahani batna. But a sukkah of the mitzvah on Sukkot, no stipulation will work. That remains off limits. So right now we're saying is that the issue of stipulation works for Rabbi Yehuda if it falls down. But the idea that you can't use a sukkah for the whole week, which is obviously more than a muktzah issue, that's absolute, and there's no way you can get out of that. Presumably also, even if it falls down, because we're talking about something, right? In the other case, we're talking about it fell down. So presumably, even when it stops being in the state of being usable for the mitzvah, once it began the chag as a sukkah, it remains off limits. Let's just read a little bit more. Okay, I want to get to the okay. Yep. So that's where we are right now. So the Gemara says, the sukkah mitzvah low. Now the Gemara is doubling back on itself. 1 minute. I know we insisted that a Tanai can't work, but it actually seems that a Tanai does work by a sukkah of the mitzvah. V'hatanya, we turn on the Beitzah, sicha chilchasa, you put the proper schach on your sukkah, v'itran, you crowned it, you decorated it, b'kramim u'b'sadinim, with different types of like scarves and whatever, and sheets, hamitzuyarim, like colored sheets, v'talaba, gozim, shkenim, afarsikin, v'imonim, v'parchili, anavim, yenus, shishmanim, v'silsos, v'atarot shibalim, and you decorated with all these beautiful things, various nuts and fruits, and clusters of grapes and wine and oil and flour. Rashi says obviously in some type of glass containers. Anyway, and like bunches of wheat. So it looks gorgeous. Not only can you not benefit from the wood of the sukkah, you can't benefit from all these nice foods that you have hanging from your sukkah until the last days of Sukkot. But if you stipulate before Sukkot begins, I might want to take some of that fruit and eat it, then you are allowed. So here you see stipulation does work. But a minute ago we insisted it didn't because the idea of Chal Shem Hamayim was an absolute. The sukkah is completely off limits. So the obvious difference is this is the noi. This isn't the sukkah itself. And there might be a difference, which is what the Gemara says. Abai and Rava both say, if you say, I am not separating myself from them, I am not withdrawing my hand from them, the entire period of Banish Mashos, meaning that when Sukkot begins, I am saying that even as Sukkot is beginning, I am not making this noi totally part of the sukkah. Even as Sukkot begins, I want to have rights to these fruit that's hanging from the sukkah, and I might want to peel off that apple and eat it. So if you say that, the noi never becomes part of the sukkah, and therefore it doesn't get sanctified together with the sukkah. So that allows your Tanai to work because they were talking about the noi, and the noi therefore can remain separate. Sukkah, but the wood of the sukkah itself, the chalak kedusha layu, that the sanctity does take effect on it, that remains off limit. So the Gemara is now introduced a new idea called huktzah l'mitzvaso, which applies even like on Chol HaMoed, which is not just normal muktzah, which is off limits because it's being used for the mitzvah. It applies even like on Hanukkah for the oil of the Hanukkah menorah. It's not about the kedusha of the day, and that remains completely off limits. The one thing you can stipulate on, even if it falls down, presumably, the one thing you can stipulate on is the noi, and that remains not part of the sukkah. So now let's just wrap this up. How is it different than that which we teach? If you separate out 7 esrogim, you're going to use a different one for each day of Sukkot. After you're done with each one, you can eat it right away. It's only set aside for the mitzvah until you do the mitzvah. Once you do the mitzvah, eat it. No, it's even after you've done the mitzvah, you can't eat it till the next day. Once it's set aside for today's mitzvah, it's off limits all of today. Okay, so that's an interesting debate, but what do they both agree? That it can be set aside for one day without the next. So how come for sukkah, if it was set aside the first day, is it off limits all 7? Maybe I should be able to stipulate and say I'm going to use this sukkah on day 1 and that sukkah on day 2 and the other sukkah on day 3. Maybe a stipulation can work. Here it works for the esrogim. So the Gemara says no. Hasam demafsik leilos miyamim. When it comes to lulav, there's a period you're not taking the lulav at night, right? So light is different than the day. Today's mitzvah is distinct from tomorrow's mitzvah. So because it's designated for the lulav on Monday doesn't mean it's designated for the lulav on Tuesday. It's not a continuous mitzvah. 7 separate days of mitzvahs. By sukkah, what's the idea? You live in a sukkah for a continuous 7 days. You're supposed to sleep in a sukkah. So it's one period. It's not 7 periods. It's one period. That's a week long. So it's all like one big day. And once it's designated for the beginning of the day, this day that lasts 7 days, it's designated and it remains off limits for the entire week. Okay. Whoa, we finished in time. Yes. And we have to vacate the room because something is